Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming this evening. My name is Ed Chervenak. I have the honor of moderating this panel this evening. I want to thank the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for putting together this series. I've attended every panel so far. It's been very informative and educational. I'd like to thank Brian for inviting me to be the moderator and also for his efforts in putting together this fine panel of experts. So anyway, let me begin. One of the first questions I'd like to ask the panelists is, to describe the condition of the city in the mid-1980s. What were some of the challenges that the incoming mayor faced when he took office?
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me introduce the panel first. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm sorry. Let me introduce the panel and then ask them to speak, about their relationship with the mayor, what they did with the mayor, working for him, covering him as reporters. To my right are Dr. Jinx Coleman-Broussard, who's an associate professor in the Manship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. She served as press secretary to New Orleans Mayor Sidney Barthelemy and as director of public information for the city of New Orleans. Clancy Dubois is chairman and co-owner of Gambit Communications and the political editor and columnist for Gambit Weekly newspaper in New Orleans. He is full-time on-air political reporter and analyst for WDSU in New Orleans for nearly 10 years and is currently an analyst for WWL-TV. Ronald Nabone is a trusted advisor to Mayor Barthelemy and has served as a member of Citizen Charter Review Advisory Committees under the Landrieu and Barthelemy administration. So please, tell us about your relationship with the mayor.
Okay, I'll start. First of all, I'd like to thank the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities for inviting me to participate and to indicate that it is an honor to be here, just as it was an honor for me to have worked with Sidney Barthelemy. He was by far the best boss I've ever had, and he made my job easy. Every day I looked forward to going to work. For a person who put the city first, what stands out, I plan to talk a little bit about what was already in the film in terms of what the city faced when Sidney took office. But I'll tell you a little bit about him, and I think you know that already. When Sidney offered me the job as Director of Public Information, he drove to my house one night in New Orleans East and said to me and to my husband, and he wanted my husband present because he said, "You're not going to have a wife for 8 years." And boy, did he ever tell the truth. But what I gleaned from that meeting was that this was a person who put the city first, who was not interested in his own self-aggrandizement, but one who had a vision for the city and where he wanted the city to go. And so it made my job, my decision very, very easy. We faced all kinds of crises when Sidney took over, and I talk about those crises in my crisis communication and public relations classes at LSU. But he always wanted an open and accessible administration. So one of the first things he said was, "I want to have a good relationship with the media. I don't want you to stonewall, and I want you to service the media." And I dare say that the media certainly knew that that's exactly what we did. Whenever the media had a question, whether we wanted to answer it or not, whether I wanted to answer it or not, I knew that my boss wanted the New Orleans public, the citizens of New Orleans, to have the answers to those questions. Because he said to me, "Jinx, we exist to serve the citizens of New Orleans. And I want you to remember that every day that you come into work to do this job." And so that's just an overview of what my job was as press secretary to the mayor. And because he was such an individual who believed in linkages and in working together, he also said, "Jinx, you have to work for the city council too. So you also have to do the city council's public information. And it was not PR. It wasn't about making himself look good. Ebony Magazine did an article on him within the first 6 months, and that article had to do with the gentle giant, because Sidney always said, I'm going to step back and let others take the credit, because that's what you do when you want to make progress. Because everybody wants to be in front of the camera, and everybody wants the glory. But that man didn't want any glory. And I'll tell you a little story of how upset I got, because I wanted to do some PR. I wanted to make the mayor look good. I wanted to highlight his accomplishments. And he said to me, being the former seminarian that he is, God knows what I'm doing. And so that's the type of mayor for whom I worked. And that is the type of mayor who was able to put aside how he looked or what people thought about him in order to make sure that we brought the Republican Convention here, that the Republican National Convention here. Everybody under the sun was at that press conference, at that announcement. And Sidney was standing toward the back, and I had to say, Mr. Mayor, get up here. So, but that was the kind of person he was. Also, bringing the papal visit here, the Junior Olympics, and a whole host of activities. He was able to get those done because he was able to step back, and let others take the credit. And perhaps that was a failing of mine, that I didn't push harder, but I couldn't push harder because he was interested in pushing the city and not pushing Sidney Barthelemy.
Thank you, Jinx. As a reporter, I had the difficult task of being the mayor's critic, because I also wrote a column in Gambit. I worked at Channel 6 as my full-time job and wrote a weekly column in Gambit, which I still write. And Sidney was one of those politicians, one of the few that I had a pretty cordial relationship with before he became mayor. He was on the council, and back in those days, reporters had much more free reign at City Hall in terms of access to elected officials. I remember breaking in Frank Donzi at City Hall. Frank and I were classmates at Holy Cross, and before I left, I introduced him around to a few folks at City Hall, and we could literally just walk up the back stairway and get into the city council offices and just cruise the hallway and see who was in their offices. And there was this corridor where the council members had offices on one side of the hallway and their staff members were on the other side. And if the council member's door was open, we'd just stick our head in and see who was there and talk to them. And boy, those were the days. You know, talk about access, talk about transparency. We didn't need a transparency ordinance because we could literally just walk in and see what they were eating for lunch or whatever. And Sid had a very, like many of his colleagues, had a very open office. He had a great staff as a council member. And so he was one of those politicians that, even though professionally I probably shouldn't allow myself to do it, but as a human being, none of us could help but like Sidney Barthelemy. He was truly one of the most affable politicians out there, and as Jinx said, he really did have no ego about himself. But I will say, Sidney, you're a brave man to sit here and listen to your critic. I'm not sure if you came here to defend yourself or to soak up the accolades or whatever, but I've come to praise you, not to bury you.
You too, Bruce.
But then when he became mayor, my relationship with him changed because we couldn't just walk into the mayor's office, not with Dutch, not with Moon, not with any mayor, and it's probably more remote now than ever. And not just, I think that's a natural tendency. It's probably true in every major city. I'm not saying it to pick on the current mayor. I'll do that in January. But it was natural and understandable and foreseeable that my own relationship with him professionally and personally would change. We certainly weren't as close as two guys might have been, just two professionals, because I had to go through Jinx, and it was just a different setup. But in a way that made it easier because it was my job to talk about what he was doing and at times to criticize it. But Sidney, unlike many others in politics, had a thick hide. He took criticism very well. It didn't make my job any easier because, like, when Dutch was in, I didn't feel so bad criticizing him because I knew he was going to shoot back. Whereas Sidney is sort of like picking on the nice kid down the street, you know, who's just going to take it. You know, it's like, God, I feel bad. I got to say something that's critical. But that's kind of how it was. But being a critic and being an editor, I want you, those of you who have this sheet in front of you, this little booklet, there's some corrections that I've been asked to make by Sidney and a few that I've seen on my own. On the third page, where it says 1989, reaches deal with Governor Buddy Roemer for state appropriation of $19 million to offset budget deficits. That must be the state budget deficit because Buddy Roemer, as Sidney mentioned in his video, was a good governor in a lot of ways, but he was not a big fan of New Orleans. Just wasn't. Pretty much like the current governor, in fact. Buddy, in fact, was the first governor to renege on the tobacco tax deal. And that was a deal that goes back to 1966 or 67, something like that, when John McKithen was governor. And interestingly enough, coincidentally enough, one of the key votes for that tobacco tax deal was Dutch Morial. Dutch voted for the tax, and as his reward, he got appointed to juvenile court, which ultimately led to him running for the Fourth Circuit, which led to him running for and winning the mayor's office. But Dutch was the first black legislator since Reconstruction at that time. And McKithen needed votes to pass that tobacco tax, and what they did was he cut a deal. The New Orleans delegation, which was bigger and more substantial at that time, all voted for the tax in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. But the proceeds had to be renewed every year and rededicated to New Orleans. And every governor since then, particularly Edwin Edwards, because McKithen, then Edwards, and then Treen, who honored it, then Edwards, and then Roemer, Roemer reneged on it. He took that money and kept it for the state. And that might be what it refers to, but it was definitely not money for the city of New Orleans. And then in February 1990, that is the date is accurate, but he defeated Donald Mintz in the primary. There was no runoff that year. And then in June 1990, city loses lawsuit over the awarding of a contract to two computer companies with personal ties to the mayor. I can't remember that, neither can the mayor. I think that's a typo. That should be June of 2008, but we'll see.
Right.
But we'll see. Mr. Letton is working on that one. Another thing that struck me as I was watching the video, it brought back a lot of memories. And to answer the question that Dr. Chervenak posed, what was the city like in 1986? If you think it's tough economically right now, and it was tough in 1986. The oil bust had happened, and New Orleans before then, man, we were flush. We were not quite like Houston, but boy, for the New Orleans and Lafayette were just rolling in it. In the 70s and 80s, I mean, every fool who stuck a stick in the ground hit oil in South Louisiana, and they all came to New Orleans. All the big oil companies and all the independents had offices here. They came to New Orleans to play, because New Orleans is still a lot more fun than Houston. And they spent money. Man, the restaurants were flush. Everybody was flush. They were having a good time. And then when oil collapsed in the early 80s, it took a few years to really make its, for that collapse to really be felt. But by 1986, it was felt. You had office buildings downtown that were emptying out. And the mayor talked about, losing jobs. And then the outgoing mayor, Dutch Morial, who was an ongoing political foe of Mayor Barthelemy. They were each other's political nemesis, you could say. Both well-intentioned, but just had different ideas about how things ought to work. And during his lame duck tenure, after Sidney had been elected, the budget had been passed, as it has just been passed in New Orleans, but the new mayor takes office then and now on the first Monday of May the following year. And Dutch got in and literally spent as much as he could possibly spend. So in addition to there being a general recession in South Louisiana, not so much in the rest of the country, but it was really hard in South Louisiana and in the New Orleans area, this mayor comes in and there's no money. And I don't, Sidney, you can nod and tell if it's true or not, but there was a story that went around, a lot of these urban myths, but I believed it at the time, that they looked for, the receipts and the bills, and there was literally a shoebox of bills. He's nodding his head, yes, there was a shoebox. That was what the finance department was like. They found a shoebox of receivables. Wasn't that what it was? And Dutch was a great mayor in a lot of ways. He really was, but that was not one of his better moments. And I'm trying to be honest but diplomatic at the same time. And so he came in with, the prospects weren't good to begin with, and then they were broker than broke. And I remember going to City Hall the first day of not a furlough, but just closing down City Hall on a Friday, and it was literally like a ghost town. And that took a lot of guts, Dutch's criticism of Sidney was that he didn't have any vision, he didn't have the toughness. It was tough to tell long-term City Hall employees who were underpaid to begin with that you're going to be furloughed every Friday. Now, they were talking about this city council looking at once a month. This was once a week furloughs. I mean, that's as hard as it gets. And yet he pulled out of that after that 1 year of real austerity. And you look at a guy who was a great conciliator and great diplomat, and who had an eye for big events, the casino, big events and big projects. The Republican National Convention, the Olympic trials in 1988, which was huge. They renovated Tad Gormley Stadium to make that happen. And he was able to attract people around him in the private sector like Merv Trail, who was a visionary and a fabulous guy who was missed every day in this town. Died many years too soon. And he was the mayor who, it wasn't his idea, and he could have taken credit for it, but he embraced it and pushed it and then stepped back and let a guy like Ron Foreman run with it. The development of the riverfront, the aquarium. It's not just the aquarium, it's opening up the entire riverfront back to the citizens, that green space known as Woldenberg Park, and developing it all the way down as far as they could. And they still argue about developing further down, but it was his administration that did it. And I remember covering the news conference where they called the news conference at the foot of Canal Street, and he got up there and said, we're going to do this. So he was brave enough and honest enough to embrace ideas that others had, make them his own, and then step back and let them run with it. Other big projects like the arena, and I'm proud to say that my newspaper was the only one in town that said this is a good idea. I dubbed it the Sidney Dome just because I had to tweak him a little bit, but we thought it was a good idea, and when it opened up, I was happy to give him credit. I don't know if anybody else did, Sid, but when we finally got the Hornets, I wrote a column saying Sidney was right, and you were right. The other thing that strikes me in looking at this video is how important it was that he had a relationship with people in Baton Rouge. Our mayor now has done some good things and he has some shortcomings like any mayor, but he really has no presence in Baton Rouge. And when you look at the tough economic times that we had in the 80s, and even Dutch, who was a fiery mayor, Dutch served a stint in Baton Rouge, and there's a club up there. And if you've ever been a legislator, you are a member of that club. And Sidney was the first black state senator since Reconstruction, just as Dutch was the first black member of the House since Reconstruction. So he was a member of the club. He could walk the floor and talk to people and be welcome. And that did wonders for New Orleans in Baton Rouge, because no matter what we try to do as a city, every city in Louisiana is a creature, literally and legally, is a creature of the state. And if our mayor does not have good relationships in Baton Rouge, the city is stuck. I'm choosing my words carefully. I'd rather use something harsher, but we are really stuck. So those are just my passing comments, and I hope I've answered the question. I hope I haven't talked too long, because Ron has a lot of insights from inside the belly of the beast.
Thank you very much, Ed, Jenks. And I won't repeat a lot of things that were said by Dr. Jenks and Clancy. And I would like to talk about Sidney Barthelemy, the man, because it said, I've known Sidney more as a friend. We've been through a lot. I've known him. We grew up politically together. When Moon Landrieu ran for mayor, that's when I first met Sidney Barthelemy. We were young men working in the 7th Ward with the political organization known as COO, St. Ard based, and said I met Sidney, and we worked in the Moon Landrieu campaign together with coup, was successful. Sidney became the first African-American director of welfare. But it also helps if you have some context in terms of understanding Sidney Barthelemy's actions as mayor, to understand Sidney Barthelemy the man. Remember, Sidney Barthelemy was a choir boy at Corpus Christi School, where we grew up in the 7th Ward. I used to be an Oates boy there. He went to St. Aug and was a football player. After he left St. Aug, he went to the Josephite Seminary in Washington, D.C. and received his graduate degree. We reunited at Tulane, where he was in School of Social Work. And he worked for TCA. Sidney was almost a priest, but he definitely was a social worker. He cared about people. And a lot of people took his concern about people and being polite to people and always calling him nice as a weakness. And always criticized him for being weak, for being intellectually insufficient. But I knew Sidney Barthelemy the man, and we would have a lot of discussions. In terms of he was honest, he was hardworking, and as Clancy said, he was willing to make the tough decisions. Not whether or not it was politically correct or not. I can tell you, I've been with Sidney politically, and every campaign he ran, everybody always predicted he would lose. And to this day, with all the strong politicians we have in the state, from Edwards to the governor to the folks in Jefferson Parish, Sidney Barthelemy never lost an election in his life. Nor did he ever retreat from the election because he didn't think he could win it. He was politically tough, he was honest, he made the hard decisions. Now, often that was misinterpreted. And a lot of things we talked about in terms of what he did and what drove him. And basically what always drove Sidney Barthelemy is what is best for the city and what is best for the people of the city. That priest mentality, that social work mentality, and some of the things that we talk about. I know this organization is looking at the historical evolution of our modern mayors under our modern city charter, which go back to 1954 and Chip Morrison. And a city charter in New Orleans creates a governmental entity where we have, quote unquote, a strong mayor, weak council. Unlike Jefferson Parish, where they have a strong council, weak parish president. And so in Louisiana, we have a tendency to like our politicians like we like our food and our music, hot and spicy. Sidney is not hot and spicy, okay? But what he does, if you look at his record, and I always have this debate, obviously there were some things that he didn't accomplish as mayor, but when you look at some of the less than dramatic things he had to do in terms of 1986, when we had a recession in the city, when we weren't building hotels, when people were out of work, unemployment was 13%, what he had to do, hard decisions in terms of those 4-day work periods, in terms of laying off 1,000 people over a period of time. And unlike the present administration and council, who gave themselves or the future council a raise and are requiring perhaps a cut, everybody, cuts were made in the mayor's office, on the city council, the salaries were cut. He participated in the suffering that everybody had to participate in, because that was Sidney Barthelemy. There was an instance where the folks, our friends in Jefferson Parish, put up a barrier to prevent black folks from going into white neighborhood in Jefferson Parish. We had a meeting that day to discuss what we were going to do. Some people said, look, let's go ask them, would they please take it down? Some people said, let's go to court. Sidney said, look, this is wrong. Let's get the crew together right now, without talking to anybody, lawyers, anybody. He just went out and took it off. I mean, because that was the right thing to do. So sometimes he was impulsive. Sometimes, like all politicians, he had some thin skin, but he made the tough decisions, even on the issue of gaming. Again, I was usually the one who worked in his political campaigns, and I think we trusted each other and discussed everything before he did it. Even though, they said he was weak, he was strong, and we would have this phrase saying, how are we going to get out of this box? Because as mayor of the city of New Orleans, we were always in a box, either politically, socially, economically. The mayor of New Orleans had to figure out how to get out of the box. And again, it was easy to understand what Sidney wanted, because if you figure out what's best for the city and best for the people, you knew what he wanted. The casino was very controversial. And again, at that time, people said the casino would ruin the city. Edwin Edwards had a different view of what the casinos could be in our city. He wanted to make the city of New Orleans wide open. We were dealing with some of the best lawyers and toughest people in the casino industry, and everybody said New Orleans would be literally raped, okay? At the end of the day, that casino went up. We had a process in terms of transparency, and Sidney was cooperative. He knew how to work with people, and this is something that a lot of people don't realize. At that time, there was a young, bullish chief executive named Jim Bob Moffitt, who started the Business Council. And Sidney and Jim Bob didn't always necessarily agree on things. They had different personalities. But Sidney and Jim Bob got together, and on the process, in terms of the selecting and building the casino, he allowed Jim Bob Moffitt to select a Big Four accounting firm to monitor everything that was going in the process, and that Jim Bob Moffitt could react publicly if there was anything not kosher in terms of that process. Not only in terms of the casino, but in terms of transparency. When Jim Bob Moffitt would ask questions about the budget, Sidney Barthelemy had a CEO open all the books. This wasn't a situation where he would just turn over the books to the council 30 days before they had to vote on it. He was open, transparent. Not all the time did they disagree, but this is the type of person he was. People thought that Edwin Edwards would screw the city. People thought that the casino people would screw the city. But with that casino that's been open for 10 years and gone through bankruptcies, the city was the only entity that always received money from that entity. 2,400 people worked there. The predictions of doom and gloom never came through. They would say it would destroy downtown New Orleans. We wouldn't have any NCAA ball games. We would lose professional ball games. We would lose college. None of that happened. And Sidney Barthelemy put together a coalition that included the preservationists, and historic buildings were saved, that included the hospitality industry, the restaurants and hotel associations. There were some people who opposed it, and it was perhaps one of the things that he'll be remembered for in terms of a hectic last term. But he put together a large coalition that, again, looked out for the interests of the city. The city survived. The casino is there. It's not a disruption that it was. Clancy talked about the opening of the riverfront, not only the aquarium, but you're talking about Waldenberg Park. And at that time, in order to make the casino work, people forget there was necessary to have a three-way deal, a swap with the dock board, the aquarium, and the city, because the river center, the Rivergate Casino was owned partially by the dock board.
There's 3 owners.
So there were 3 owners. So Sidney Barthelemy had to work out a complicated three-way swap that would enable the dock board to get money so that they could move and relocate their maritime facilities, to give an opportunity for the aquarium to develop, and to give open access to the river for the citizens in Waldenberg Park, and to build that casino. And one thing, that casino was built, it cost almost $300 million to build that casino. And during the whole process, this is something that people often forget, the city did not spend one penny, not one penny during the process to get that casino built. And during 2 bankruptcies, when the casino went into bankruptcy, the city did not lose one penny because of how it was designed with the casino. Now, the other thing, too, we're talking today about legacies going forward. We're talking about doing something with the municipal auditorium. Another little thing about what happened to Sidney Barthelemy. As part of that casino deal, the developers wanted to open a temporary casino. As part of the deal, the developers had to renovate the casino up to a tune of $30 million, again, and it was used again for city functions. Again, this is how he looked outside the box and did things without looking for much attention. One last thing, and while all this was going on, a social disruptive thing was going on, and that was the controversy over the city ordinance on Mardi Gras. I mean, it was pushed by the council, it was the right thing to do, and it was very disruptive. Mardi Gras could have been a strike again, it was very divisive, but Sidney, again, got involved, worked out a compromise, where even though we lost 2 very conservative parades in terms of marching, the ordinance was passed in terms of what should be the right thing, in terms of no discrimination, in terms of any entity that uses city streets. And most of the Mardi Gras crews stayed in and participated, and we still have Mardi Gras today. So again, I'm here to talk about some specifics, but also to talk about the man Sidney Barthelemy. And Doctor?
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to add one other thing to it.
One historical footnote to what Ron said about the complexity of the Rivergate deal to make that the site of the permanent casino. The Rivergate had several owners, maybe even a dozen. I don't remember. It was very complicated because you had a family that owned a strip, like a narrow 10-foot strip under it, and they were against gambling, and there was a lawsuit about that. But don't underestimate how complicated it was even to deal with the dock board. Mayor Barthelemy's opponent in 1990 was the chairman of the dock board. That was no accident. The dock board also is a state agency, not a city agency. So it's not like the mayor dealing with, Nord or something that he can control. The mayor has no control over the dock board. So he had to go up there with Edwin Edwards and get Edwin to agree to let that be just one casino, then to let it be on a city-owned square So Edwin could not cut any deals on that piece. He had to give up something there, which Edwin Edwards never ceded authority or power to cut deals on anything, but he wasn't going to get the votes out of New Orleans unless he did this, and Sid was able to hold the New Orleans delegation together. And then he had to negotiate with the dock board, yet again, another state entity. So it was a very complicated series of, political pulleys and chains that had to be navigated to make this thing work and to lift this thing up and make it happen. The other thing was how complicated racial dynamics were in the city. We didn't really get into that, but Ron touched on it. The Mardi Gras ordinance was probably the most public of those fights, but in a lot of ways, there were a series of little brush fire wars, if you will, any one of which, like the barriers in Jefferson Parish. And I don't know if there's any other person who could have been mayor during that time, who could have kept things from boiling over, other than a guy like Sidney Barthelemy, because he had the trust and respect of black and white citizens and black and white leaders. He could keep anybody from getting too far out of line. Maybe that's the social worker in him, maybe that's the almost priest in him, I don't know. But he had that presence and that demeanor and that relationship with people on both sides of the racial divide, that he could keep things together and still let people say what needed to be said. And that's something that you could only look at really from the standpoint of history. It's not something that we all could see at the time, although Ron maybe saw it because he was in there trying to keep everything from boiling over with Sidney, but I wanted to get that out there as well.
And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, the fact that he was always intent on bringing people together, looking at how we could form relationships that were mutually beneficial, not just relationships that benefited one group or another, but bringing everybody together. And so that was one of the mantras by which we lived, and by which he was able to establish and to carry out his vision. One of the things also was just the fact that Sidney was so darn transparent. Every week we published his schedule, and we disseminated that schedule to the news media. So there were no questions about what he was doing and where he was going or what he was up to, because the media knew exactly what was taking place. And so he, as I said in the beginning, he quietly got things done, and he let others take the stage so that we could get the riverfront opened up, so that the convention center would be expanded, and a whole host of other activities and initiatives.
All right, thank you. Well, I wanted to shift gears a bit here and move from economics to politics of the Barthelemy administration, and what challenges the mayor faced in getting elected. What kind of coalition you put together. We noted in the film that it's a diverse city. What kind of organizations supported him, which organizations opposed him, and of course, who were his voters.
Can I take the lead on that?
Yes.
I covered it you go back to Moon Landrieu's election, and Ron's going to build on this, I'm sure. Moon put together what was called the Landrieu Coalition. He was the last Caucasian mayor, but he was the first mayor to put together a real citywide coalition of black and white voters. And it was the same coalition, actually, that got Dutch Morial elected. But Moon's coalition was overwhelming support in the black community, 90+%, and maybe a third or so of the white voters. Certainly a minority. Maybe not even a third. I forget what the exact number was, but it was a minority of white voters and a solid block of black voters. And that was the liberal, if you will, urban coalition, which I think Iris Kelso dubbed it the Landrieu Coalition. And it held up for Moon. He was reelected against token opposition for his second term. And when Dutch Morial ran, he had basically the same coalition, probably more higher percentage of black vote, because he got something like 98% of the African-American vote in the runoff against Joe DeRosa, and 20% of the white vote, but it was the same dynamic. Then when Sidney ran, it was the mirror image. He had a minority of the African-American vote, but a very solid majority of white vote. But it was a similar kind of biracial coalition. His runoff opponent was Bill Jefferson, and Ron can talk more about the nuances of this, but as someone who studies politics and was studying it then, there was an undertow that a lot of whites didn't see in that race, but it was an undertow in the black community. You know, every mayor that we've had, every African-American mayor that we've had has come from the 7th Ward, has been from the so-called Creole Belt. And Bill Jefferson represented an alternative to that within the black community. He was going to be a dark-skinned Protestant black mayor from uptown, as opposed to a light-skinned Catholic Creole from the 7th Ward. And there was something I learned back then that my African-American friends will know was they would do this. It was sort of like a secret, code. It had to do with how dark your skin was, And that was a big thing going around, a big undertow in 1986. And I remember when Sidney, in the night of the primary, because there was a strong white candidate running with under-the-table support from Dutch Morial, a guy named Sam LeBlanc, been a big, Chamber of Commerce guy, a lot of bona fides. And Sam thought he was going to get the white vote and then get help from Dutch in the runoff and become, the next mayor. Sidney held on to a majority of the white vote in the primary against a strong white challenger or candidate, and Jefferson had a significant amount of black vote, and Dutch stayed officially neutral in the primary. And when it was announced, when the results were in and Sidney came out to make his speech the night of the primary, when it was clear that he was going to be in the runoff, his first words were, "We rode the tiger," because that was a reference to a column that Alan Katz had written about him, saying, can this guy ride the tiger, meaning can he hold together a biracial coalition when there was pressure in the white community to vote for the white guy to get a white mayor again after 8 years of the first black mayor, and there was pressure in the black community to vote for a black mayor, Bill Jefferson. He was the guy in the middle, and very often under our open primary system, the guy in the middle gets squeezed. And he did not get squeezed. I don't know if the paper says he ran second, but I'm not trusting this anymore. Did you run first or second? He ran second, okay. But it was a fairly close second. It wasn't a huge gap. And Sam ran third. But I remember he took that podium with a big smile, and he shouted, "We rode the tiger." And in the runoff, it was, I think, pretty clear that he was going to win, but it was still very touch and go for a week or two because there were blacks, our political operatives who were putting the word out, he's not really black. He says he's not really black. And there was even a commercial that Jefferson's campaign ran. Sidney thinks he's white. Remember that? It was very, very ugly. So that was in Atlanta. A lot of whites never heard about that. But that was, politics is a full contact sport in this town. And that's putting it mildly. It gets really ugly, and it gets very personal. And you cannot have thin skin and last in a race for mayor. And you can run for some other little offices and it's not so bad. But when you run for mayor, you can expect to get hit on everything you've ever done and a whole lot of more things that you never did. Anyway, I'm going to let Ron finish up on that. But that's the politics as I remember it.
Well, in 1986, the politics were a little different from what they are now. Unlike everybody waiting to see who's going to run for mayor in February's election, we qualify in December. The mayor's race in '86 started 2 years ahead of time, basically in 1983. And what happened in 1983, Dutch was the first African-American elected mayor, very popular. He was a cause. And in his second term in 1983, he decided to try to change the charter, just as Morrison had tried in 1960, to remove the two-term limitation of the charter. And that was in 1983. And one of the organizers of the opposition to that change was Sidney Barthelemy. Sidney Barthelemy announced that he was going to run, and he helped organize the opposition. And if any of you old enough to remember those situations in terms of, Clancy said Sidney was Dutch's nemesis, they did have some different styles. But I can tell you over the years, and I'll give you, ended up in terms, they respected each other, and they never criticized each other personally, okay? I mean, it was good, hard, tough politics. Dutch was smart, he was aggressive, he was one of the best politicians around, and Sidney Barthelemy survived that. So the mayor's race started in '83, and then in '85, again, Dutch tried to change the city charter. Not to remove the term limits this time, but to amend it so that a mayor running could run for a third term. We called it the 3 terms. And so that's what was going on. And what happened was that, as Clancy mentioned, there were 3 major candidates at that time. Sam LeBlanc, who was presumed to get most of the white candidates. He was white, but he had close ties to the Morial administration. And Bill Jefferson, who was a very popular guy, and Clancy referred to some of the dynamics in terms of the racial and class distinction. Sidney was a Catholic, as I mentioned, Corpus Christi. And Jeff was also, one thing that Clancy didn't mention, he was also an outsider, okay? He came from North Louisiana, and he came down here. Not only was he darker skinned, but, and he wasn't Catholic, but again, he came down here, was very aggressive, and elevated himself in the political circles in a short period of time. So with that race going on, and with Sidney being mild and weak, everybody figured Bill Jefferson would be mayor, okay? And again, the dynamics in terms of political squeeze play, as Clancy mentioned, in terms of the open primary, you had a white candidate, very popular, well-financed, Sam LeBlanc, a very strong African-American candidate, smart, Harvard-educated, and they were Sidney Barthelemy. Where's he going to get his votes? And the challenge that Sidney had to prevent was being squeezed, so that at the end of the day, it wouldn't be a runoff between Sam LeBlanc and Jefferson. Again, Sidney was able to get a good cross-section of not only whites from uptown in Algiers and Lakeview, a large enough percentage, but he also got a large percentage of blacks from downtown New Orleans. If you look at what's happened in terms of African Americans in the city, historically, our 4 mayors have come basically from downtown, on the downtown side of the canal. You know, the Morials, Sidney, and our present mayor, Nagin, grew up downtown before he moved to Algiers. So the motherlode of votes in the black community are downtown, and Jefferson was fighting that, and he lost. And what happened was Sidney got in the runoff. He came in second, okay, because his task was to get in the runoff, and he knew that from the beginning. As long as he got in the runoff, he felt comfortable. But once he got in the runoff, it was a race between Sidney and Jefferson. And as Clancy said, they tried to make this a racial thing in terms of Sidney was the white man's candidate, Jefferson was the black man's candidate, and there was a prominent minister of a large congregation who from his pulpit declared Sidney the tool of the devil himself. I mean, it got that intense in terms of what was going on. And I can tell you in terms of someone who was intimately involved in it, it got even more intense in the streets, because Jefferson had his brother Morrison from Chicago who wanted to show us little weak Creoles from the 7th Ward what politics was like. So it got pretty hot in the streets in terms of street politics. But again,
It was Benny who got his ass kicked.
he did, and said, and again, the local boys showed the guys from Chicago and from Dry Prong, Louisiana, what real politics is about.
Lake Providence.
End of the day, Sidney won that race.
Lake Providence.
Lake Providence. And I do want to make this point, because Jefferson was not running without strong support. He had strong support among the ministers, and he also had the strong support of Mayor Morial. Jefferson, in December that year, was about out of money, but for the fact that Mayor Morial went to him and re-energized his campaign with money and everything else. The only mistake, I think, from this point, and we were glad to see it, when he did that, he got on stage with Jefferson, they raised their hands together in triumph, a bit premature, and that's all we wanted. At that point, Sidney got most of the white votes, and he was elected with most of the white votes and a third of the black votes. That was his first primary election. When he ran for re-election, a lot of controversy about crime. The economy was still bad, and again, people were predicting, and I can say this because it said we had posters. Our friend Joe Walker was doing polls, and it showed that Sidney, was in the 40% in terms of popularity, and everybody was saying, Sidney, you shouldn't run. Also at that time, Dutch Morial was threatening to run. So, I mean, you have the most popular black African-American mayor who was a cause. You have Sidney Barthelemy, who's weakened. The white community had abandoned him. What was going to happen to Sidney Barthelemy? And again, talking about whether or not he's strong or weak, people were predicting, 1, that he wouldn't run, and 2, that if he ran, he couldn't win. So Sidney and I got together and said we had our own little communications. We had some high-powered consultants and everything. But at the end of the day, Sidney maneuvered in such a way where Dutch decided not to run, and that was no accident. Okay, I'll just put it that way, because there were communications between the Barthelemy campaign and Dutch on that and other issues. A very popular attorney, Donnie Mintz, was running, and Donnie Mintz in his campaign thought for a long time that Dutch Morial would come out and support him. That never happened. Unfortunately, in December before the election, Dutch died, even though qualification had passed, and it was obvious he wasn't going to run against Sidney, but Sidney was able to put together the traditional coalition that African Americans use, ministers, even the ministers who called him the devil, organized labor, and strong black voter support. And in that race against Donnie Mintz, Sidney won the second term. So that's the politics in terms of his race and in terms of that, Doc.
Let me add one thing. On that, I'd heard from Bill Jefferson, of all people. I sat down with Bill in 1999 or 2000, and we were talking about the governor's race, but Jeff told me a story about Dutch's decision not to run. I remember covering that news conference. It was a big deal because Dutch, he was better at playing it close to the vest than any politician I've ever met before or since. And Jeff told me that had Dutch not died, that there was actually, and Ron mentioned, communication between the Barthelemy and Morial camps. He said that Dutch had made a commitment to Sidney, and I'm going to ask Sidney if this is true, that Dutch was going to actually support Sidney in that race. He's saying yes. I don't know if that's ever been printed, but I heard it, and I've kept it secret because or in confidence, because I assumed that when Jeff and I were talking, it was in confidence, but for the sake of history, I'm going to go ahead and say that. But that's true, Sid. And Dutch died. That was probably the one time these two old foes were going to come together, and it was going to really be historic that Dutch was going to endorse Sidney for re-election, and then he ups and dies. So it's not the first time he disappointed you, Sid. but that would have been something to see Dutch raise Sidney's hand on the stage for Sidney's re-election.
And let me just mention something else that never made the news, and Sidney never mentioned, and only a few people in Sidney know it. Not only was Dutch going to support Sidney Barthelemy for mayor, but Sidney Barthelemy and Dutch were going to work where Dutch was going to run for U.S. Senate. Remember, at that time, you had a race with David Duke and Benny Johnston, and Dutch was going to get in that race. Sidney and all the black mayors across the state were going to support Dutch, and the one out on that one would have probably been Benny Johnston. And we would have probably had a runoff for U.S. Senate between an African-American Dutch Morial from New Orleans and David Duke. And that's the rest of the story.
Dutch knew how to pick his opponents.
That would have been exciting. One of the issues that seems to plague New Orleans, and for a long time, has been the issue of crime. I know that we do an annual quality of life survey at University of New Orleans Survey Research Center, and over the last 20 years, and except for one poll, crime tops the list of people's concerns. And so I was wondering, what measures did the administration take to deal with the issue of crime?
That was always a nemesis for us. That was always a thorn in our side because the drug epidemic, of course, was raging. I remember Sidney flying to D.C., meeting with the drug czar, bringing William Bennett down here, looking for all kinds of ways to get additional funding for additional police officers. We explored community policing. We tried almost every avenue that was possible to try to get a handle on the drug situation and on the crime situation in the New Orleans community. Ron and Clancy might want to add a little bit more to that, but it was an ongoing struggle, changing police chiefs, working on securing funds for community policing, having crime summits. I believe we also implemented midnight basketball, working with the DARE program and initiatives of that nature in order to try to get a handle on crime.
I'm going to defer to Ron.
And as Jinx mentioned, crime was a problem that created problems for for Mayor Barthelemy in his re-election. Crime was growing. New Orleans faced some of the highest murders, especially in that second term, exceeding 400. And Sidney explored the possibility of bringing in national policemen. In fact, one that I can say, he spoke to Lee Brown, who was police chief in both Houston and New York, and Mr. Brown at that time said he was thinking about running for mayor of Houston. But some of the other things that Mayor Barthelemy tried to do, in addition to what Jinx talked about, was he passed a dedicated millage to pay for uniforms and equipment for police officers, uniforms, equipments, radios, telephones, like that, and that millage was passed. He also worked out an arrangement where all police officers who were on desk or disability, or at that time, who were working in central lockup were taken away from central lockup. The sheriff took over those responsibilities for central lockup, every policeman, and it created some tension in the police force because you had some old police officers who had cush jobs in the DA's office, who had special assignments and desk jobs, and Sidney Barthelemy gave orders to his police chief to put every available police person on the street. Now, despite those efforts, well-intended and everything else, crime was one issue that I think, in all fairness to my friend, he and we never did get our hands on. And that was, I always had this discussion with some of my friends that if you mention 9 things, you would have to give crime as one thing where Mayor Barthelemy did not succeed, not necessarily because of his efforts totally, but to be objective, crime was an issue that we never did get our hands around during his administration.
One note on crime, that when the city finally did get its arms around that problem in the 90s, we brought in a new police chief and some consultants and all that, but probably the biggest issue, the biggest factor, rather, that made a difference in the crime rate was the economy. The economy in the 90s got better. Crime went down nationally, not just in New Orleans.
Well, part of the economic rebirth revolved around the casino, so I was wondering if you discuss the mayor's role in bringing gambling, the casino, to the city.
Well, I think he pretty much talked about that in the film, in the video, in terms of, working with Governor Edwin Edwards, and I think Ron and Clancy both have kind of elaborated on the kinds of coalitions and the behind-the-scenes actions that took place in order to get the casino here. I don't know if there's any more that we can add beyond what we've already said on that.
And I would like to mention a couple of things because some people think that maybe Sidney Barthelemy took the easy way out. He tried a lot of different ways of raising revenue. He tried service charges, which didn't fail. He tried refinancing bonds, which created some money. He tried dedicated revenue, but still the city was always short. Remember, one of the state mandates the city had then and still has is its criminal justice system, which is anywhere from $25 to $30 million. So in trying to figure out something, Louisiana had gaming, and I'll say gaming, the proper word, gaming already. We had the lottery, we had the racetrack, we had video poker, we had the riverboats, which the city had nothing to do. So Sidney Barthelemy wanted to get what I called a controlled gaming revenue. Controlled in the sense that, unlike Edwin Edwards, he did not want multiple casinos. He wanted one, okay, a first-class casino. He put together in his manner, over a period of time, a diverse coalition, because when he started this, a lot of people were against it for different reasons. The hospitality industry, for example, didn't want competition in terms of hotels, in terms of free rooms that the casinos would bring in. The restaurant industry, for example, the Restaurant Association, didn't want the casino to give out free food. The preservationists didn't like the concept of changing downtown New Orleans at the foot of Canal Street.
Tearing
down the Rivergate. They were opposed to that. Sidney worked with these various coalitions, and we also had a governor who had a different view. So you had this mayor who was people perceived as being weak, going against Edwin Edwards, going against the Caesars of the world, who had the best attorneys, all the casino, Steve Wynn from Las Vegas, and they came down here, and I remember some of the critics saying, how can Sidney Barthelemy protect the city against all these wolves, okay? And Sidney had a concept where, in terms of passing legislation that was only responsible because of the political power and will of Edwin Edwards. But because Sidney tried to get a couple of things. He tried to get the mayor to appoint on a gaming board and direct revenues from the casino. Edwards said, no, all the money is going to come to the state, and I'm going to put on the board members. But what Sidney did get that's unappreciated is he got the state legislation which authorized land-based casino gaming in New Orleans to be site-specific, which meant they could only put it one place, at the foot of Canal Street. And that was the key in terms of Sidney using something which had never been done anywhere in the country. Because in other parts of the country, New Jersey, Las Vegas, and any place else, there was no casino where the city owned the casino itself. So we had two processes that people didn't understand and were confused about. The state passed a legislation which would authorize gaming, and the state issued the operating license. The key and the leverage that Sidney had, which was ingenious, was that he leased the site and selected the developer to develop the site. And in order to protect the citizens against future encroachment by the state, especially somebody like Governor Edwards, he passed something in the city charter we talked about before in terms of strong mayors. He passed something that people didn't appreciate at the time, what they call a just one casino, which meant that if we put that in our city charter and it passed as part of the protective mechanism to protect, because Sidney didn't want New Orleans to become like Las Vegas. He wanted to preserve the character of New Orleans. Casino Strip. And again, in terms of negotiating with everybody, including preservationists, he saved certain buildings, and the preservationists eventually came out and supported the concept of the single casino. The Business Council, who was skeptical about what was going on, they hired a Big Four accounting firm to monitor everything going on. Even though they never came out and supported it, they did not take a position against it. The newspaper hired one of their top-notch investigative reporters, a guy by the name of Tyler Bridges. He was at every meeting, looking at everything, assumed everybody was a cheat and everybody was going to go to jail and everything else, but he found nothing wrong. Well, I'm talking about the Barthelemy administration, because during this whole process, when we talk about Sidney, not only did nobody get indicted or go to jail because of the casino processes, nobody for any reason connected to the Barthelemy administration was indicted or went to jail. That's something that was significant, because everybody assumed something was going on, and I said Sidney was honest, and he made sure everybody who worked for him was honest.
Right.
And at the end of the day, even though he faced all these powerhouses from around the country, the Winds of the world, the casino people, Edwards, we got this casino, it's there 10 years, and it's part of our livelihood now. Nobody notices, but it's still employing 2,400 people with good jobs and good benefits, and did not destroy the character of our city. That's in terms of Sidney doing something that was controversial. The paper was against him and everything else. And again, not one public dollar, not one public cent was paid for the renovation of the auditorium. And some people are talking about spending several $100,000 more of city money to do it. Not one penny was paid for the building of that casino over there. And at the same time, we opened the city to the river. We got our aquarium. And again, the dock board got us everything else. And that was the type of person Sidney got. Again, he didn't look for credit or everything. 10 years after everybody predicted doom and gloom and the city would go to hell, excuse the expression, from the casino, there was an article in a business magazine, National Business Magazine, where the people from Las Vegas were saying they were the ones who got screwed by the city. The little quiet mayor. So that's the thing about gaming.
One quick thing, just on the politically, bottom line, the casino would not have happened if the mayor had not been for it. End of story. You know, and that's true whether Sidney was mayor or anybody else was mayor. You'd had to have a mayor for it, and you had to have a mayor push for it. And Ron went into all the details, and I just want to put this in, step back and put it in a bigger perspective. Edwin Edwards wanted to put a casino in New Orleans, but it took a mayor in New Orleans who was for it and for doing it a particular way that Ron described to make it happen. Because even before Edwin Edwards had the idea, Sidney proposed the idea of putting a casino in the French Quarter at the Wildlife and Fisheries Building, which is now the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeal and the State Supreme Court building. It's a beautiful building. And the idea was to have a small European-style casino. And one of the few places I've been to is Monte Carlo. And that building actually looks a little bit like the Monte Carlo casino. It's small and certainly European. And you know, you have this, you know, James Bond, everybody in a tuxedo kind of attitude about it, but I doubt that the Monte Carlo casino makes as much as Harris makes. And in a way, it was a blessing that idea failed, but the idea of a single casino downtown is what took hold. And by the way, my paper supported you on that one, Sid, as we supported you on a lot of other things, too. I'm looking back thinking, God, we were for that, we were for that, we were for that.
And what people don't know is that the aquarium would never have occurred either. Ron Foreman sat in a meeting with Sidney and asked the mayor to place on a bond issue to make the permanent funding or a revenue stream for the aquarium and the zoo a part of that bond issue. And that passed. And that is why the aquarium is where it is today and why the zoo is on firm financial footing. So again, it was working with others and forming these kinds of coalitions, and a mayor who was willing to let Ron Foreman take the credit to this day for the aquarium and the zoo being what they are today. I don't think Sidney has ever said, I placed that on the bond issue. and it passed. Therefore, you have money. If that had not happened, the zoo would be in the same condition it was prior to Sidney's administration, and the aquarium would never have happened. And so again, this is an indication of how he sat back and let others take the credit. And when we talk about making tough choices, we talked about the city employees being furloughed for 1 day a week. Some city employees were furloughed 1 day a week because the mayor said, some of you have to work because the city's business has to continue to get done. And even with that, he still let city employees know how valuable they were. And so he worked with the criminal sheriff's office, with the aquarium, with the Audubon Institute, and with the RTA to sponsor activities on Fridays for the city employees who were furloughed, so that they would be able to get free tickets to go to the zoo. We had a picnic out at City Park where the sheriff's office did a lot of work on that. And so it wasn't just leaving people behind, it was making sure that everybody felt that they were important and that everybody was bearing the burden for what was going on.
Let me add one other thing. Jinx just touched on this with regard to Audubon. There was a huge fight during Dutch Morial's tenure in 1983 and 84, right, when he was trying to extend his terms, between Dutch Morial and the Friends of the Zoo, which is what the Audubon Institute was called back then. And it was about who would run the city-owned asset known as Audubon Park and the zoo. And Foreman and others had come up with this model that had actually been used elsewhere, so it wasn't a brand new thing, but it was new to New Orleans. And Dutch wouldn't let it go. He wanted to hold on to it. And Sidney came in and says, we're going to let this happen. And what he did was he let Audubon come in as the Audubon Institute, and I don't want to say take over, but take over management of the zoo and the park. And that model has been used by Breck in Baton Rouge and elsewhere. And it's a very, very successful model. And he allowed the Audubon Institute to grow and become what it is today, which is a world leader in that model of management. And it actually saved and took the Audubon Park into what it is today and made Woldenberg Park and the Species Survival Center, all of the Audubon assets were made possible because Mayor Barthelemy said to Audubon, okay, I'm going to give you this chance to do this, don't mess it up, make it work, make it right, and they did. And so that was a pretty courageous move too, because there were people that thought this was some white takeover of the zoo, and Audubon is very diverse and all that, but there were all these racial suspicions at the time. But he stood behind it and let it happen. And it allowed Audubon Institute to become the local powerhouse and the world model that it is. But it was not an easy thing to commit to at the time. It was not something that he did without taking criticism for it anyway.
And let me just mention, you said he let it happen, but he did more than let it happen. He helped save it. Because Ron Foreman and his friends Zoo came up to the mayor's office one day and said, here's our program, how we want to sell this bond proposition. And he had little nice fishes and water and everything else. And Sidney said, wait, we're not voting for fishes. People are not going to vote for fishes. They're going to vote for jobs. So Sidney Barthelemy gave them the advice, say, make this an election about jobs, not about fish and aquariums. And that was a major political decision.
Right.
What lessons can we learn from Mayor Barthelemy's years in office? What's his political legacy in the city?
Be nice.
Quietly get things done, but toot your horn sometimes, because I think one of our greatest failings is that we did not tell Sidney's story well enough, such that there is misinformation on the program. And so have a management style where you focus on mutually beneficial relationships all the time, and where you work to get things done and have the vision.
And I think his other legacy in terms of protecting the charter. I mean, we hear a lot now about the charter and the powers of the mayor. Sidney and Dutch before him fought hard to make sure we had a structure of government, which was a model at the time was passed in 1952, our city charter, where we gave our mayor, made him a strong mayor. And Sidney and Dutch both protected that. But Sidney, in terms of other legacies, also was about cooperation. Cooperation with the city council, cooperation with the state legislature, cooperation with the federal government, even though there are Republicans in the state and Washington. And people often overlook this, even though there was the barrier situation with Jefferson Parish. I can tell you, there was never more communication between Jefferson Parish and the city of New Orleans than during the Barthelemy administration. I had a friend on the other side by the name of Mike Guiney at the time, and they worked together in terms of cooperation, and that is important in terms of legacy, in terms of whatever problems we're going to face. We have to cooperate not only among ourselves in the city of New Orleans, but with our neighbors across the lake and across the 17th Street Canal, and that's what Sidney Barthelemy, I think, will be best known for.
I think a combination of things. As a physically, he left a tremendous mark on the city. The casino, the aquarium, the arena, the riverfront. There were a lot of French Quarter improvements then, too. On a human level, he held it together when the city could have really come apart on racial lines, and that didn't happen. And that's not something that you see the way you can see an aquarium or you can see a casino or an arena. But it's something that if you live through it and you know something about the dynamics of a city, you know how important that human relationships are. And he held that together. And I think a style, it's taken a long time, Sid, for your style to be appreciated. But I think that sometimes Providence sends us the leaders we need, whether we realize it or not. And you were the guy we needed then.
Well, before we turn over to questions from the audience, I was wondering if the panelists had any final statements.
No.
Let's give it a big hand to the panelists.
First question.
I don't think anybody that was involved in the '86 campaign would say anything besides the fact that Mayor Barthelemy was a very good guy. And the campaign actually inside the opposition was much uglier than the panel has said tonight, especially during the runoff. The thing I'm not understanding is that if I listen to the panel, this sounds like 8 years of triumph and one of the most successful mayors in the city of New Orleans. And outside of this room, there's an alternative view, and I'm wondering, is it just because the story hasn't been told, or is there other things to be said about what happened during the 8 years during the Barthelemy administration?
Well, I think I mentioned that one of the things that clouded his accomplishments was the fact that he wasn't a self-promoter. And the other thing, that crime is always a big issue. It's a big issue today, and it was then. And the crime situation overshadowed everything. I mean, if people weren't secure in their homes in the neighborhood, that overshadowed everything. And a lot of things that Sidney did were not sexy things. But when people saw the crime rate going up, that basically overshadowed all his other accomplishments. And when you had a controversial project such as the casino, that, again, questioned his style and accomplishments. But I always mention it's never good to use a negative as a point of accomplishment. But if we look at today what's going on, not only locally, but with all the things about him being weak and crime and everything else, I always point out to people, there were a lot of complaints about whether or not he was misusing his patronage, but not one of people associated him went to jail or was indicted for casino, which people thought was dirty, or for any corruption in City Hall.
Paul, you make a good point, but I think that we're looking at this from a standpoint of many years later, and so we tend to remember the physical things because you can point to them and see them. Sidney was criticized for being weak. I remember City Business wrote an article, and the big headline was "The Rudderless Ship." That was the metaphor that they used, and I think it was one that Donald Mintz even used when he ran against Sidney in 1990. His administration was a rudderless ship. And when you think about the arena and the casino, both of those were conceived under his administration, but they weren't completed until years later. So he did not So at the end of his tenure, there was this feeling of, oh, this is easygoing guy, and we need somebody more energetic. And I just finished writing a story for Gambit that's going to come out this weekend. And Stephanie, y'all better not pick this up in the picking. But about how at the end of every 8 years of a mayor, the voters tend to look for somebody not only different, but almost opposite. But the pendulum swings on axes that are not always predictable. It's not like Democrat, Republican, or black-white. But with Dutch, it was one of personality and style. Dutch was a very fiery, intense guy, and we needed to kind of exhale. And so Sidney represented a likable guy, a capable guy, but a guy who allowed us to exhale, at least on the issue of, personalities. And then after Sidney's, style, it was again, I think a matter of style. We wanted a more energetic mayor. Not that Mark did more, but he certainly projected more energy. It was just purely a matter of style. After Mark's 8 years, we had Ray Nagin because it was not so much a matter of style, but we're tired of the politicians. We wanted a non-politician. And now we're all looking around for somebody who's not Ray Nagin. And not just not him, but as not like him as we can find. And it happens, and it's not unique. I paint that picture because it's something to put in perspective. It's not unique to Ray Nagin. It's not unique to New Orleans. It happens on the national level. When Barack Obama is about as not George Bush as you can get. So it's a natural human tendency. So at the end of Sidney's 8 years, a lot of the stuff that he is going to be remembered for hadn't really come to fruition yet. And it's just a question of, we're up here on a panel looking at things, and we're trying to find things and go back 20 years and recreate in our minds. So we tend to look at the high points. It's just kind of it's a natural human tendency. The low point clearly was crime. Public education is another one. Police department, not to criticize Sid, but it happened on your watch. A lot of the really bad cops that were thrown out during Morial's years and were put in jail were hired during his administration. He didn't go out and hire them, but they happened to be hired while he was there, and so he's going to get blamed for that if there's going to be blame to be had. Some people say that that NOPD lowered its standards during those times. I don't know if they did or they didn't. I was around then, but I wasn't covering NOPD. But there was a push as a result of a lawsuit, a very well-intentioned lawsuit, to integrate NOPD more because it had been too much of a white good old boys club or bad old boys club for too long. And it was a lawsuit not only to hire more African Americans, but to promote more African Americans. And Dutch's administration settled that lawsuit and put into place what in effect were some quotas. They didn't call them quotas, but they were quotas. And that was something that Mayor Barthelemy inherited, but he had to implement. And so it was not only crime, but I think a culture at NOPD that he couldn't control, but it happened on his watch. And the culture at NOPD became one of some, not all of them, but there was a subculture, I'm going to say, at NOPD of corruption. And we had guys like Len Davis and maybe even Antoinette Frank who were hired during that time, guys and women. So there were some things that weren't going well. And you're right to point that out. But as we stand here in 2009, looking back, 15 years or more, we tend to notice, as you look at any landscape, you tend to notice what sticks out, not what's just flat.
And even when things were going well, there was often difficulty in getting the media to pay attention to those things. The many police stations and fire stations that were constructed under Sidney's administration, I remember trying to get coverage on that and being told, well, that's good news, and that's what the mayor's supposed to be doing. And so often the bad news is what gets the major focus as opposed to the good news. Oftentimes we had to use letters to the editor to tell the mayor's story because that story was not getting picked up just in the daily course of events, just by trying to call attention to those things. And because Sidney was very unassuming and didn't really care about that, that was not his focus, so that the story didn't always get told, and when we tried to get it told, it didn't always make the airwaves or make the newspaper.
Well, it only took 90 minutes for it to be the media's fault. No, just kidding.
Not criticizing the media.
Well, Jinx, I'm going to give you a chance to do that in a minute, but I want to just make a couple of points. The issue of crime, I left New Orleans, and I've been knowing Sidney for a long time. He's actually good friends with my brother. But I left New Orleans, I think, after your third year in office in '89, so I missed most of your term. But I can tell you the two cities I lived in during your term, Columbus, Ohio, and Gary, Indiana, also had a serious uptick in crime. And Sidney's administration really paralleled the whole crack epidemic.
Yeah.
It really did. It happened in cities across the country, so I just wanted to throw that out. And I think, you know, Clancy made a good point about all the things that happened, the physical things. But didn't the airport really get some improvements under Sidney, too? I can't remember, or was that Mark?
Didn't we add a flight to Mexico
I
at
can't
that
remember.
time?
I was talking
And
about more
several
physical.
others. Yeah.
More physical
In
improvement.
fairness, I think every mayor has added some physical improvements to the airport. Largely, it's been a matter of fiscal constraints. When the money's there, they improve it. There's been a master plan on not on the shelf, but on the books for a while, and they keep trying to finance what they can because they're limited. We had higher landing fees, I think they're called, and that's an issue. It's like raising taxes to pay for NORD and anything else. If you can raise taxes high enough, you can have the greatest city in the world, but you're going to be taxing the hell out of everybody. So it's a balancing act. But yeah, there were improvements made, I think, under every mayor at the airport.
Okay, now the tough questions. Clancy, can you address the 1978 election when Sidney ran for councilman at large when Dutch was first elected? Did Sidney get more votes than Dutch in that election?
See, the election was actually held
He ran for council at large.
in 77.
Right.
And did you
Right.
run at large in 76 or in 77?
Same time.
77. Okay,
Same
same thing, because
time.
there was a delayed election for the city council in 76 because of a lawsuit over reapportionment and redistricting. Had to go all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And we finally had our city council elections. Now, the mayor election was held, but we had delayed city council elections in 76, and we had some new members elected then. And then in 77, right, Dutch ran for mayor, and then Sidney ran for the council. What you're saying sounds true, but I'm going to ask Sid, is that true?
I don't, well, maybe Ryan knows better.
He'll know.
I was elected in the first.
In the primary.
Yeah, I was responsible for counting votes when Sidney ran.
That's what I want to know. How many votes did you
And
count
it
for
is a
Sidney
fact.
versus? That's my question.
Sidney ran for council at large, running for the first, and was elected the first African-American, and Dutch ran for mayor. And Sidney did get more votes than Dutch in the primary. Now, in order to be fair, they had many strong candidates running for mayor. So Sidney got more votes. Dutch was forced into a runoff, if you remember, against DeRosa. But Sidney won because he was always weak and everything, but he won the first primary, even after the elections were done. So he did get more votes, but it's not fair to say that because it said Dutch was running against 4 or 5 strong candidates, and he got a smaller number of votes. But even when Dutch beat DeRosa, Sidney also received more votes than that. And one thing about racial politics in this time, one thing Sidney did that was historic. He and Georgia Russo were not exactly the same philosophically. They were 2 councilmen at large, but something that's never happened in the city before. A lot of times when people run for council at large, you can vote for 2, and they'll cooperate with each other. But Sidney and Georgia Russo, the priest and the cop, ran as a ticket. They had the same bumper stickers. This was re-election. This was re-election, yeah. They had the same bumper sticker and both long names. They had the same commercial. And that was the first time it's done very diverse politically and socially, but they ran as a team. Again, Sidney was able to get along with everybody, and both of them won.
Okay, Ron. Now
That was one where each one really did help the other. And Sidney's election you didn't ask this, but let me point this out. Sidney's election in 77 to the council at large, we have those 2 at-large positions, and unlike Jefferson Parish, where you run for either A or B, and voters get to vote for 1 in A and 1 in B, in New Orleans, it's a free-for-all, literally a political free-for-all, where you have any number of candidates running for 2 seats, and voters vote for 2. And to win, you need to get 25% plus 1 in the primary. So it has all sorts of permutations and calculi, in terms of how you get to that magic number. And it just complicates things even further. But it was after he got elected and ran with Joe for re-election. But his election in 77 was the beginning of what I call the New Orleans version of the social contract, where it was never written, certainly, it was written about later, but there was this unwritten, unspoken understanding for many years that New Orleans should have one black and one white council member at large, and Sidney was the first black. And because he and Joe ran as a team, I think that actually kind of came as close as anything to putting that social contract in down, reducing it to writing. It was reduced to a bumper sticker, I guess you could say. And the voters bought into it, and it happened up until very recently. And one of the reasons why it was able to happen is we had a good black candidate and a good white candidate, at least one of each, running each time, or strong, if not good, but I think good politically, in the sense that somebody who could get votes and could put it together. And it was only until very recently that that did not happen.
Okay,
And it took somebody going to jail and having a special election for it not to happen. But I think we might see that resurge. I don't think there'll be a ticket necessarily, but I think you will see a black and a white at large after the next election. It's
Okay,
just a
thank
question
you.
of who.
I just wanted to exchange, how have the media changing out since then? And that's all I need to know.
I can tell you how the media changed from the Morial administration to the Barthelemy administration. Clancy asked me the question at the press conference when my announcement was made that I'd be press secretary, and he said, "So are you going to continue stonewalling?" And so I said, no, we're going to be open and accessible, and we're going to service the media. And that's exactly what we did. When Clancy indicated that you said you had to go through me, but oftentimes you all went through me all day, every day. I remember George Ryan being in the office and reading upside down. That's just how open and accessible reading, standing in front of my desk and reading what was on the desk. So we made sure that we worked with the media, that we serviced the media, and I don't know the extent to which that is still happening today. Based on what I'm reading in the paper, there is not an openness with regards to working with the media, and let's face it, you rely on the media to get your information out to the public as well as to get feedback from the public. And so my advice to anyone who's working in a public information position or as a press secretary is to try to find out what the needs are of the media and to meet those needs, to always be open and honest and accessible.
One of the things that we're trying to accomplish with this panel is give a broad historic perspective of the city of New Orleans through these administrations. And I'm wondering if the indices that we're using, kind of following Paul Steckler's question, if the indices we're using to measure success or failure maybe need to be examined a little bit. You've referenced mostly things such as physical structures, with some economic impact attached to them, such as the casino and Waldenberg Park. But one of the questions I hope we're going to be asking ourselves as we move through this series is this city been improving, and if so, how? And if not, why not? And what I've found interesting in the 4 or 5 term administrations we have discussed to date is we're not discussing whether or not we have higher high school graduation rates, more college graduates. Crime has been mentioned, and it's not gotten better. Okay, we still lead the nation in homicides, infant mortality, per capita income. I mean, these are really the kind of criteria and indices. During the period, if you look at the chart, and I hope something on that program is correct, but from 1980, one of the things we're tracking are the demographic changes because that affects the politics. From 1980 to 1990, the population of the city stayed, the black population stayed almost exactly static, and the white population declined about 65 or 67,000. In the next 10-year period, black population upticked slightly, about 15,000, but the white population went down 35,000. I'm less concerned about the racial part of it than the tax base part of it, because paralleling that during the period was also the flight of the black middle class out of the 7th Ward and out of Central City and into the more suburbanized parts. So the question I'd like to ask the panelists to think about is, when examining the city during this administration and even across the span of them, right, have administrations been thinking and enacting policies that are actually improving the life and quality of the city on indices that matter, right? And not measured simply in terms of whether or not there's a football team or a casino or a park on the river.
Let me start by addressing the comment you made up front in terms of what we discussed. We were answering questions. And I think perhaps in future ones, and I'm going to be on a future panel, maybe we need to do a better job of framing questions. The questions were good, but they were directed towards these physical things, political and physical things. So we're feeling our way through this. And I think these population statistics are good, but I think in terms of infant mortality and graduation rates, I don't have those statistics in my head. Nobody up here does, but in the future panel, we should do the research and present that so that we can then ask people to comment on it.
Well,
Because I don't know what the infant mortality rate was in 1980 compared to 2000. I just don't know.
and I don't know those statistics either, but I will tell you that under Sidney's administration, we received a major grant from the federal government, and it was the Healthy Start program. And that was aimed at reducing that 16 out of every 1,000 births, 16 deaths out of every 1,000 births. And I don't know whether that program is still ongoing, but it certainly was ongoing throughout the entire Barthelemy administration, and the infant mortality rate went down. I also know that the mayor tried to work cooperatively. Let's face it, the mayor does not run the school system. But Sidney worked with Morris Homes in order to try to enact initiatives that would improve our school system, just trying to form those linkages and so forth. I know you're probably thinking I'm being a hack here or a flack or doing spin and so forth, but those things did transpire during that administration. I don't know whether they are happening right now, but they happened at that time. Who was it before? Everett Williams? I don't remember. Was it Everett Williams? I don't remember the superintendent.
Yeah, he was and she gave me the mic.
Thank you. 'Cause
We're going to regret this.
Let me, shy as I am, let me say a couple of things about the educational system. The mayor does not run the school system. It didn't then, and it doesn't now. And I think if you look at the present system, I know everybody's saying it's doing well, but what we're missing is the number of kids who are dropping out of the system. They were dropping out then, and we started the truancy centers at the time. I don't know if you remember that, but we had 3 truancy centers throughout the city that the city of New Orleans funded. The other thing was, I believe I may be the only mayor in the history of New Orleans to support a millage for the school system, because that meant putting the school system before getting the millage for the city. And I thought the school system was that important at the time. And I wanted to mention those things because we did try to work with the school system. The Healthy Start program, we were one of 2 or 3 cities in America that got that grant. And Sheila Webb was the deputy director of the health department. And she made a concerted effort to work with all of the health programs in the city of New Orleans and the school system. We also started the first health program in the public school system. So we are very much aware of those things. And I also spent 15% of the CBDG money that came into the city for social services. Not hard stuff, but social services, daycare, health care, and all of that. And the maximum we could, and NORA too, right. We did the summer program. Every summer we had a summer youth program to keep kids off the street. So we were very conscious of not just the physical things, but the social
Quality
things.
of life issue.
Sid, while you got the mic, let me point out something too. Ronald Reagan was president when you became mayor. No, he cut out the Head Start program. So this was a national thing.
Right, right. And he cut revenue sharing.
Right.
Yeah.
That we
2 things that had put in by
$30
Nixon,
million,
actually.
you know, and you can't not understand the impact that money has on trying to deliver services to the city. I mean, you can never have a great city if you don't have enough money to provide those services. And the way that many of us use community development block grant was to supplement the services that many communities or part of the poor communities couldn't get the same services that the affluent communities got, and you use CBDG to supplement that. And that's what we were doing at that time. So we were very much aware. Were we perfect? No, no way. You know, made mistakes, many. But I think, as the panelists said, not that we were perfect, but we tried our best, and we did put the city first in the thoughts that we tried to implement. Thanks.
Thank you.
And just to comment briefly, I think you're right. We should learn from history, okay? And we need some objective criteria in terms of determining what is success and everything else. What we got to keep in mind is the structure. You know, what is the city responsible for? What it can do and cannot do. You mentioned crime. We mentioned school, education, for example. The city has nothing to do about it. Every mayor's race, we have something. A candidate will get them, I'll do this about school. The mayor has nothing to do about education in our city, okay? Same thing, limited health care. It's in terms of giving you a time continuum. When Moon Landrieu was mayor, 70% of the city's budget were federal dollars, okay? When Sidney was mayor, it was down to about 30%. And I would guess that now Nagin is mayor, it's probably 20 to 25%. So money is always important. And you have money comes from two places. It be seen in recovery. Primarily the federal government, the only one, and the state. The city has limited resource in terms of how it can raise money. And you can't sales sack yourself out of anything. But you're right in terms of success, we gotta watch that, and you're right in terms of tax base. You know, it's always related to color because more people are poor who are African people of color. So in terms of future things, we have to figure out how we can maintain the tax base and where we're getting our money, and make sure when we determine what's success or not, who has authority and responsibility and the power to do something about it.
If somebody's taking notes, maybe one criteria that we could look at, and if, I don't know where we'd get this information, but if we could look at how many occupational licenses there were in town, which is a statement about the local business community. And that is something that the mayor is at least partially, if not directly partially responsible for, creating a good business climate. That might be an interesting barometer. But we should still look at the overall health of the city. We should look at high school graduation rates and infant mortality rates, but look at some economic indicators. How many jobs are there? How many, again, occupational licenses? That's something that the city keeps records of, and because the city issues those. How many building permits were issued from year to year? And you're going to get a strange blip after Katrina, but you can factor that out and still look at how things went.
Can you talk briefly about Mayor Barthelemy's management style within City Hall? I think you talked about the weak reputation in the media, and then conversely the how he defended the strength of being a strong mayor under the charter. And I think this is apropos of what you've been talking about, that really one of the main things the mayor does is to appoint department heads and actually run the city on a day-to-day basis. Can you talk about his management style within City Hall? Was he holding department head meetings? Was he getting involved in day-to-day operations, or was he more someone to delegate things to department heads and then let them run with it?
Let me say something briefly about the perception of style, and I'll defer to these two because they were part of the team. After Dutch Morial, Attila the Hun would have looked weak, okay? That's just, it was a matter of style, okay? So I'll put that out there as a matter of perspective. And as for the specifics of his management style, I'll let Ron and Jinx talk about it because they were there.
Jinx?
Well, the mayor hired good people, and he gave us our marching orders, and he expected us to do what he hired us to do. We had cabinet meetings every Monday, and those meetings started at 8 a.m. and might have lasted until 10 or 11 o'clock, and then we knew exactly what we were going to be doing for the week, for the entire week. I would say that it was a decentralized style that we had, a decentralized culture where Okla Jones, who was in the law department, had the authority to speak to the media or to speak on behalf of the law department. Jinx Broussard had the authority to speak on behalf of the mayor, provided I cleared in advance what I was going to say. And so his style, I think, was not authoritarian. It was one that allowed people to maximize their abilities to the best extent possible.
And I've observed everybody has a different management style. We talked about Dutch, who was mayor before. Dutch was hands-on. He knew everything going on. Sidney was a different management style. I'm not saying which one is better. It depends on the people you work. But Sidney would appoint somebody, give them an objective. I'm an old military person, said, this is what I want done. You do it however you can, within this time period, within budget, and do it legally. And, come back and report to me if you've done it or not. And why, if you haven't been able to do it, why? He didn't micromanage everything. And some people saw that as weakness because Sidney didn't require that yes men and women work for him. There was open discussion about what was going on, criticizing some of the things the mayor did. There was open discussion on a lot of issues. Some people see that as a weakness. I personally see it as a strength. But again, he gave people discretion to do things and had them accountable in terms of whether or not they did it, whether or not they did it on time, whether or not they did it on budget, and whether or not they did it legally. But he didn't micromanage.
Didn't y'all have meetings on Saturdays as well?
Yeah, there were meetings that said, obviously as mayor, you're running both government and you're involved with politics. So you have to be aware of where the two intersect. And there were regular meetings, I know, with his department heads, independent board people, and his political advisors and friends in terms of what was going on. So those were regular meetings where people had to report to him in terms of what was going on.
One of the other things that he did was make sure that people within his administration were attached to as liaison to the various boards and commissions, so that he always had his fingers on the pulse of what else was happening in the other ancillary parts of city government.
One person who's not here tonight, who should be mentioned because of the role she played, is the mayor's wife, Mickey. And he's grinning because our mutual friend, Joe Walker, may he rest in peace, was part of some of those Saturday meetings, the political meetings. And Jim Carvin was fond of saying, if I want to get to the candidate, because he always worked, he didn't work at administrations, he worked only with candidates. He always said, I don't do policy, I do politics. But he said, if I want to get to the candidate, I used to say, I want to see who's driving the candidate. But he said, now that I'm older and wiser, I want to know who's sleeping with the candidate. So he would always work the spouse. And Joe told me once that after these Saturday meetings, they'd all have a little huddle and they'd talk about their politics. And Mickey Barthelemy took a very hands-on approach in some ways because she actually had an office. I know she trusted Sidney, but she wanted to be right there and be involved, which is he was foreshadowed Bill and Hillary Clinton, two for the price of one. But they would have their Saturday meetings at City Hall and have their political meetings, and Joe confided to me, and I've never said this, but Sid, I'm sure you heard it. They'd have their meetings and then they'd end, and Joe would whisper to Hank Braden, okay, now how long is it going to take Mickey to undo everything we just decided here today?
Last question.
I want to make a comment. I work for Sidney. I met him 40 years ago. I was only 10. But we were students together at Tulane, and that's where I also met Ron. And I had the pleasure of working with Sidney in housing. And he always preached he trusted the people that he hired until you disappointed him. But most cases you didn't, because you never wanted to disappoint him. And he was a hard worker, very compassionate about people, very accessible. And he made sure that we were also very accessible to everyone. I have a story. One day, his secretary buzzed me on the intercom. She said, you need to come to the back. I said, what's going on? Well, a homeless man met the mayor, and his security guards would have a fit because he was just too accessible sometimes. He brought a homeless guy up through the back elevator, his private elevator, and listened to the guy's problem and said to me, help him out and fix it. That's the kind of person that he was. And he was a pleasure to work with because he trusted you to do your job. Mm-hmm. And because of that, you never wanted to disappoint him. So.
We do have one question. Judge Kern Reese, who was part of a lot of this stuff, is here, and he had his hand up. Can we let him ask the last question?
Just got to get one anecdote. Sidney appointed me to the Regional Transit Authority, and I owe a great deal of whatever I've accomplished to this man because he has been an absolute pillar in my life. But in 1890, with the service of the clergy to the city, they were allowed to ride free on public transit. And we had been threatened by the ACLU on behalf of some other ministers of other denominations to let everybody ride or discontinue the process. So we say we have to discontinue allowing the clergy to ride free. And this nun got on the bus and she had to pay. She walked to City Hall. I think she taught him. And she sat in the mayor's office until she got to see the mayor. And he invited her back. And she says, I had to pay for the bus. He tracked me down. He said, Kern, why do the nuns have to pay? I said, we're about to get sued by the ACLU. Let them sue you. Take them off. Make sure they understand that they have to pay and give them some time to get used to it. That's the man.
All right, I'd like to thank the panel. I'd like to thank all of you all for your questions, which make this program work. We'll be back on December 16th for a panel about